In Greek mythology, Prometheus is said to have stolen fire from the gods to give to humans, allowing them to advance as a civilization, to cook, to keep themselves warm, but also to make tools for war. This made the gods very furious, and for his actions he was punished. Chained to a cliff, each day an eagle would eat out his liver, and every night his liver would grow back, only for it to be torn again the following day. And despite his agony, he was unrepentant, taking pride in the knowledge and power he had given to humans. With the power of foresight, it's also possible Prometheus had seen this coming, but yet he did it anyway. The story of Prometheus has influenced many books. It would also influence the title of one of the more notable biographies of Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb. In the late 19th century, scientists in Europe had made significant discoveries in the field of nuclear science. Marie and Pierre Curie had discovered polonium and radium in 1898, and Einstein had proposed his theory of special relativity. In 1932, British scientist James Chadwick discovered the neutron, and in 1938, German scientists had made the startling discovery that uranium nucleus could be split. This was nuclear fission. These discoveries would lay the foundation for the invention of the atomic bomb. After a successful replication of the experiment by his colleague, Oppenheimer would not only be convinced of the feasibility of splitting the atom, but also manage to deduce that the process would release extra neutrons that could be used to split even more uranium atoms in a chain reaction that would release enough energy to build a bomb. This was particularly impressive, given that initially Oppenheimer didn't believe the atom could be split. But after a demonstration by his colleague, it took 15 minutes for him to be convinced and also deduced that the process would release enough energy to build a bomb. Born in 1904 to first and second generation German immigrants of Jewish ethnicity, Oppenheimer was born into an America in which then President Teddy Roosevelt was promoting an alliance between government and science to forge a progressive era that would help solve America's problems. His family's Jewish identity was around a uniquely American brand of Judaism known as the Ethical Culture Society, which celebrated rationalism and a progressive secular humanism. And whilst not a religion, its members promoted social justice and humanitarianism, pushing for change in political issues including race relations and labor rights. At its school, children are raised to be reformers in society, and Robert Oppenheimer would excel. A polymath, Oppenheimer was interested in philosophy, literature, English, calculus, history, and he would eventually major in chemistry at university. However, after his first year, it took physics classes where he was lectured by notable physicists including Nobel laureates such as Percy Bridgman and Neil Bohr. As an adolescent, he often had bouts of depression, and after graduating from Harvard, he would go to Cambridge, England, where he began studying physics. Whilst in England, his mental health seemed to get more fragile, and despite seeing a number of psychiatrists, was not able to make much progress. In March 1926, he visited Corsica with some friends, and something pivotal happened on this trip that would lead to an improvement in his emotional states. Whilst not entirely clear what it was, we know that he read Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time, in which a narrator undergoes a process of self-discovery. It was perhaps his study of self-discovery that allowed Oppenheimer to overcome his depression. He is quoted as having said, "I feel much kinder and more tolerant. I could now relate with others." That same summer, Oppenheimer would travel to the German town of Göttingen, where he would continue his studies. The university was a hub for theoretical physicists, including notable individuals such as James Franck, Otto Hahn, Paul Dirac, and many others who had made important contributions to the field. By the time he returned to America, Oppenheimer had made a name for himself in the field of theoretical physics, having published 16 papers in the space of 3 years. Working on a number of problems in his early academic career, it frequently shed light that would eventually lead others to make major discoveries, such as theorizing the existence of the positron 2 years before its discovery by an experimental physicist. As a lecturer at Berkeley, he initially had little interest in politics, but after Hitler's rise to power in 1933, he began to play a more active role. His anger at the treatment of Jews in Germany and the impact of economic insecurity would lead him to be active in a number of front causes, even though he was never a member of the Communist Party. For example, he supported refugees fleeing the Nazi regime who were often academics like himself. He would also form relationships with social activists who were often members of the Communist Party. This included Jean Tatlock, a Stanford medical student who he would eventually date for a while and later on have an affair with. His brother, Frank, was also a member of the Communist Party, as was his later wife, Kitty Oppenheimer. Some of these friends would convince him to give cash to communist organizations in their support for political causes. By October 1939, FDR had authorized a committee to research nuclear fission, and amidst growing fears that German scientists were more advanced in their research and keen to contribute to the war effort, in December 1941, after Pearl Harbor, Oppenheimer officially joined the committee. He was made director of the Manhattan Project in Los Alamos, New Mexico. A fast learner, Oppenheimer picked up the necessary skills to lead this group of scientists to design the atomic bomb. Even though by the end of 1943, the Americans had gotten word that the Germans had abandoned plans for an atomic bomb, the scientists were committed to building the bomb, and so they continued. America's war on the Pacific Front had seen the drop of napalm on Tokyo, resulting in 100,000 deaths. Other Japanese cities had been firebombed, as well as German cities including Dresden and Hamburg. Some of the scientists working on a bomb proposed that a demonstration of the bomb be used instead of actually dropping it. Oppenheimer, however, sided with those who wished to drop the bomb to save American lives with immediate use. He was also convinced that its use might prevent war in the future. In July 1945, the Trinity test was successfully carried out. The resulting glowing fireball over the New Mexico desert would cause Oppenheimer to quote the lines from the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." A few weeks later, in the early hours of an August Monday, an atomic bomb called Little Boy was dropped over Hiroshima. A few days later, another was dropped over Nagasaki. Japan would surrender shortly after. In exploring the feelings of Oppenheimer and other scientists after the bomb was used, it's worth considering that many of the scientists who favoured military use were unaware of important developments in the war, including the fact that Japan was close to surrender and its government understood that they had lost the war and were willing to surrender. General Eisenhower had thought that an atomic bombing was not necessary because Japan was close to surrendering, as did President Truman himself. What would the scientists working on a bomb have done if they knew about the near surrender of the Japanese? Would they still have wanted for the bombs to be dropped or not? It's difficult to say. In the few hours after its successful use, Oppenheimer was quoted as having said that his only regret was that it hadn't been developed in time to use against the Germans. At Los Alamos, some celebrated and others took on a more solemn look. After resigning as director of the mission, Oppenheimer would spend time between Washington and California warning about the dangers of a nuclear arms race, showing concern about the new nuclear world he had helped usher in. It's clear that Oppenheimer thought the use of the bomb was necessary, but was equally aware of the reality that the nature of war had changed. Fearing nuclear proliferation, he proposed the idea of an international control overseen by an international atomic authority, suggesting that a world government in the field of atomic energy be set up, in which there would be renunciation of sovereignty to protect the world from atomic weapons, whilst benefiting from atomic energy. This was however rejected by individuals who wished to preserve America's atomic monopoly. This would lead to an arms race that would culminate in the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's however unclear how effective Oppenheimer's plan would have been, given the requirement of inspections, which would probably have been rejected by Stalin. By 1947, having grown disillusioned at the prospect of an agreement between America and the Soviets, he later concluded it necessary for the United States to arm itself by building more atomic weapons. That same year, he accepted a job as director of the Institute for Advanced Study. He would push for it to be home to both science and the humanities, emphasizing the role that humanities had. The FBI, led by Edgar Hoover, had set up a wiretap in Oppenheimer's home by the end of 1945 as part of an investigation into his communist links. And even though they could never prove any membership with the Communist Party, they managed to use information gathered in its investigation in an inquiry to decline his security clearance. At this point, Oppenheimer had made political enemies, among them a naval officer by the name of Louis Strauss, who, while serving as chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, would begin an investigation into Oppenheimer. During a 4-week humiliating hearing, using illegal evidence collected by the FBI, Strauss would attack Oppenheimer's credibility and portray him as a security risk. Even though he would later be exonerated of accusations implying that he had passed on secrets to the Soviets, the hearing led to Oppenheimer's security clearance being revoked. These investigations were a reflection of the anti-communist zeitgeist, and Oppenheimer had become a victim of McCarthyism. Part of the reason Oppenheimer had been so thoroughly investigated was his hesitation to build a more deadlier bomb, a thermonuclear bomb. As a result of the investigation, it became much harder for politicians to challenge America's nuclear position, thus leaving limited room for debate in the early stages of the Cold War. Despite all this, his relationship with the Communist Party was unclear, as the FBI would learn in the following years. And even though some of his friends had the idea he was a fellow member, he always maintained he was never a member of the Communist Party. By the late 30s, he had expressed disgust at the totalitarian nature of the Soviets after hearing of the tyrannical atmosphere in Russia from fellow scientists. By the 60s, his image had been somewhat rehabilitated, especially by Liberal Democrats, who saw him as a victim of McCarthyism. And even though he was no longer allowed into government, he was given an award for public service. Oppenheimer's feelings about his role in the creation and use of the atomic bomb remain ambiguous. In 1956, speaking to the graduating class of his son's school, he expressed feelings of regret about Hiroshima. He was convinced that America's leaders had lost restraint by bombing Japan. But also, during the 1960 visit to Tokyo, when asked by reporters, he said that he did not regret having something to do with the technical success of the bomb itself. However, it's clear that in his later years, he still believed that the Truman administration had used the atomic bomb on an enemy that was already defeated. Oppenheimer was often critical of theatre portrayals of himself, in which writers depicted him expressing guilt about the building of the bomb. In a 1966 letter to a former student of his, Oppenheimer stated never having expressed regret for his role at Los Alamos, but instead a feeling of responsibility about the present. That is, America's role in nuclear proliferation. It stressed the importance of responsibility, saying, "Now, I don't know how to describe my life without using some word like responsibility to characterize it, a word that has to do with choice and action, and the tension in which choices can be resolved. I am not talking about knowledge, but about being limited by what you can do. There is no meaningful responsibility without power. It may be power over what you do yourself, but increased knowledge, increased wealth, leisure are all increasing the domain in which responsibility is conceivable." While he was aware in his role in the suffering of others, he would not succumb to guilt, but accept responsibility. The story of Oppenheimer and the creation of an atomic weapon that would forever alter the nature of modern war is a highly important one. Overall, his thoughts were not black and white. It's important to acknowledge the ambiguity of his feelings about the use of the atomic weapon in Japan. Till today, debates continue about the necessity of its use. The Cold War was a direct consequence of the diplomatic failures of the Truman government in dealing with the Soviets. Ongoing geopolitical disputes, including Russia's invasion of Ukraine and tensions with Iran and North Korea, are all shadowed by the looming threat of the use of nuclear weapons.